Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you who are in the Western Hemisphere. Good evening to those of you who are tuning in from Asia. And welcome to today's IISS webinar on the assault on the Capitol and Biden's challenge. I am David Gordon, Senior Advisor for Geoeconomics and Strategy at IISS, and I'm joined by three of my absolute favorite colleagues. We have Dr. Kori, the former Deputy Director General of IISS and currently Director of Foreign Policy and Defense Studies at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington. Dana Allin, our long-serving editor of Survival Magazine and a decades-long Yank in London, and Ben Rhode, who is Senior Fellow for Transatlantic Affairs at the IISS. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to start off with a couple of rounds of questions for our three guests and ask them to answer these questions in 3 or 4 minutes each. And then after that, we will be opening up the floor for questions. You can either type in your questions under the Q&A button at the bottom, or you can raise your hand and I will call on the individuals to state their questions. We do have a hard stop at 10 o'clock this morning, but really happy to have everyone here. Of course, here in Washington, everybody is excited about the inauguration tomorrow. But let me start by asking each of you, how should we think about what happened here in Washington on January 6th? And I'm motivated to do that. There was an interesting article in the Washington Post over the weekend that interviewed experts on wars, revolutions, and coups d'etats. And basically the general theme here was that the war analogy, the revolution analogy had been overplayed, that even on January 6th, Washington was not Kabul. Washington was not Baghdad. These events weren't parallel to the spring awakening in the Middle East. I remembered my own memory in 1982. I was in Kenya during the summer of 1982 when the Air Force attempted to overthrow the government then, and it was a very scary time. Again, nothing here felt to me like that. For me, January 6th was a deeply frustrated President of the United States inciting a large mob-like demonstration to attack the Capitol, not with a strategic plan, but with the hope that somehow this would allow the outcome of the November election to be overturned. Certainly a seditious act, fully justifying impeachment, in my view, despite my judgment that calling this an insurrection or a coup is probably an overstatement. But I'd love to hear the views from our speakers, and let me begin, Dana, with you on what should we think about in generally categorizing the events of January 6th here in DC. You're muted, Dana.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, David. Yeah, I mean, how to think about it, it is in line with the difficulty we've had about thinking about all the disruptions and, if I may say so, the bizarreness of the Trump presidency, because, you know, there's a temptation and obvious evidence for this temptation to treat it as farce. And there are farcical elements to it, to be sure. But people died. People's lives, and beyond the people who actually died, elected representatives' lives were threatened. And, you know, by all accounts, the mob came very close to possibly finding Pence or Nancy Pelosi. And given what they did to a policeman, it's kind of what some of them did to a policeman, it's not hard to be pretty terrified by what they might have done if they got their hands on Nancy Pelosi. So, you know, it's true. It's not Kabul, it's not Baghdad. But one thing I wrote last week, or in a few days, a day afterwards, is it reminded me, just partly because of my age and when I came of age, it reminded me of Madrid in 1981. When, you know, that was a fragile democracy, a post-Franco democracy. It was overtaken by not a mob, but by military officers. The difference we would have always assumed is that American democracy is so much more stable and so much more solid. And I think that probably remains correct. But, you know, we have what you and I, David, and for a webinar 6 months ago, talked about a crisis of legitimacy in the United States. And although President Trump may not have had a strategy, as you put it, he certainly had an intent. And the intent was to overturn the election. And he drove this crowd in there based on, I don't want to use the term "the big lie" to make any particular historical association, but it was a very big lie, which was that he didn't lose, and that the election was stolen from him. And, you know, the fundamental problem moving forward is that conviction, that false conviction, is held by a very sizable minority of Americans, and that makes the future look somewhat difficult.
Thank you very much. Good comments. Kori.
The insurrection, it does feel like an insurrection to me, right? A violent mob whipped up by political rhetoric and with murderous intent that is political in nature, preventing the electoral votes from being announced, the potential to take hostages and do them physical harm for political purposes. I agree that the president, I love the way Dana said it, that the president may not have had a strategy, but he clearly had an intent. And yet American democracy doesn't feel fragile to me, because actually the remarkable story is that 4 years of President Trump as a political arsonist didn't do more damage than this. That despite him repeatedly endangering the media by calling them enemies of the people, the American media is as vibrant as ever, covering the president, revealing financial links, all the things we expect good journalists in a vibrant democracy to do. You know, for all the damage President Trump and his enablers have done to the Republican Party, it was Republican secretaries of state and Republican governors in Georgia, Arizona, and other states that insisted on the integrity of the election process and did not allow themselves to be suborned in their oaths of office by the president clearly attempting to fraudulently overturn the election. The mob that attacked the Capitol, whipped up by the president and others, including sitting members of Congress. Nonetheless, when those same people encouraged just 2 days ago mobs to attack state capitals, it was a bust because the FBI has been out. I read that there were over 200,000 tips offered to the FBI, enabling the arrest of some of the major figures in the attack on the Capitol. Moreover, it's actually kind of surprising it hasn't come up just yet. None of the institutions of state were involved, right? Like, the military wants no piece of Trump's shenanigans that endanger democracy in America. And there may have been policing failures during the attack on the Capitol, but there wasn't collusion by police in the attack on the Capitols. And if you haven't yet seen the video of the DC cop who was pinned behind the door saying, "I would do this for nothing, and we'll do it until it stops needed doing," is actually quite comforting given the danger the president intended to do.
Thank you very much. Ben.
David. Dana and Kori have already kind of drunk a lot of my rhetorical milkshake. So just adding to what they're saying, I mean, yeah, on one level, the events of January 6th were a chaotic, kind of haphazard, but nevertheless still real attempt to subvert the US Constitution that led to, I think it was 5 or 6 people dying, including a policeman being beaten to death. In some ways, it's a kind of logical conclusion of much of the discourse of the past few years. This kind of Manichaean, paranoid discourse about there being enemies in the United States who are determined to ruin our way of life, one way or the other, in various kind of degrees of sinister activity. More especially, it's the consequence of the discourse of the past couple of months when President Trump repeatedly and persistently discredited the results of the election. 2 weeks after the election, 88% of Republican voters said that the election was not legitimate. These words have consequences. And I'm sure we all remember 2 months ago, people saying, oh, well, let the narcissistic baby throw his toys out of the pram for a bit and deny that he lost. He needs, the psychological closure, let him get over it. Well, no, we've seen what happens as a result of this. And I think it's a horrifying reality. I mean, Dana was talking about this in particular, is that, almost half of the US population in some ways now inhabits a parallel universe. We live in this epistemological wasteland where large swathes of the population simply cannot agree about the most basic facts, like who won the election. And I think this is going to have really seismic consequences for governing the US going forward.
Thank you very, very much, Ben. And that's a great segue into the next question. Tomorrow, Joe Biden will take the oath of office, becoming President of the United States. How will these events influence his early days in the White House? How should they? So what would you say if you were asked for advice? And what about soon-to-be former President Trump? Somehow, I don't think he's likely to join the generally sedate club of former presidents Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, and they certainly are not going to want him to be in that club. So both on Biden and on Trump, let me start with Kori, who had a recent article in Survival magazine on the future of the Republican Party. But start off, please, with some comments on Biden first, then turn to the Republican Party after the Trump presidency.
So I think President-elect Biden has been handling this exactly right as a political matter, which is it's the Congress's job to impeach and convict the president. And he's focused on what needs doing to get vaccines into Americans' arms and pass a stimulus bill and issue 10 executive orders on his first day in office to overturn some of the most egregious malfeasance of the Trump administration, like the Muslim ban. And so I think President-elect Biden has rightly focused on governing the country. One thing I would, one fact I would point out, slightly different than Dr. Rhode said, is that it's not 50% of the country that's living in a parallel universe. It's 30% of the country. And that is actually a significant difference because it's a serious problem. Ben's point is exactly right. But the difference between a third of Americans and half of Americans being in that space actually really matters. Donald Trump's the only American president whose favorability rating never reached 50% in the entire course of his presidency. And that actually gives us a lot to work with. I think President Biden's making the right kinds of political choices, which is to be a calming force of governance, because in my judgment, that's how you defang the craziness, which is reminding people that government exists to enact policies that actually solve problems. And while I don't think policy failures is what led that mob to the Capitol, I think that's a much more problematic psychological problem for us to handle. It's not the economics of the modern American economy. But I do think that the pandemic is, slightly unmooring a lot of people. And so policy problems are part of the solution. That is to say, I'm eager for it to be infrastructure week. And I think if we which was a long running joke during the Trump administration, that we never had infrastructure week. As to the Republican Party, this past 2 weeks have been extraordinarily illuminating. You had the third ranking member of the House of Representatives, Wyoming Representative Liz Cheney, Vice President Dick Cheney's daughter, making a public statement that she supported the impeachment of the president, that she thinks no president has ever been more in violation of their office. That only carried 10 Republicans in the House with her. Whether it creates conditions for members of the Senate, you'll recall it's the tea that cools the saucer that cools the tea of American politics. Whether the Senate will have more Republicans show up, I think, will be an important measure of what Donald Trump after the presidency will be like. It, of course, makes a difference that he's been banned from Twitter, his preferred means of engaging the American public. And it's my fond, fervent hope that the president returns to Mar-a-Lago, tries to raise $2 billion from his supporters for a presidential library there, and lashes about ineffectually in trying to affect the future of the Republican Party. But I think the impeachment trial and its outcome in the Senate will have a lot to do with that, because Republicans have an opportunity to break with a destructive president. And if even in the Senate they don't choose it, then they are choosing to associate themselves with the 30% of Americans that remain living in an alternative universe.
Thank you very much, Kori. Ben, you also have an article coming out shortly in Survival, really about the paranoid style in American politics reemerging in the age of social media.
Sure, yeah, I mean, channeling Richard Hofstadter's famous remark about the paranoid style. And the point that Hofstadter made, first of all, it wasn't an American phenomenon, it's an international phenomenon. And he pointed out that the country where the paranoid style had the greatest success when he was writing in the 1960s was obviously Germany. But he looked throughout modern American history and he pointed out these kind of successive waves, these paranoid movements of people talking about, Masonic conspiracy, a conspiracy of the Illuminati, a conspiracy of the Catholics, and in his time, the kind of McCarthyite communist conspiracy, and people saying, that JFK was a communist agent, et cetera, et cetera. I think we should remember, that the week that President Kennedy was murdered in Dallas, there were posters up in Dallas saying, wanted for treason. This man was a traitor against the United States. So, crazy elements are certainly nothing new to the United States or to most countries for that matter. I think there are some interesting differences, though, between Hofstadter's time and ours. I mean, Hofstadter talked about these paranoid movements being, quote, minority movements. And obviously that's no longer the case now. The President of the United States is espousing some of these views, the most powerful man in the world. And many of these kind of ideas have entered the mainstream. And I stand corrected by Dr. Schake about 30% versus 50%. I wasn't trying to push forward any kind of alternative facts. It's hopefully a term we can relegate to this era. But I think it is important to be aware that a lot of these ideas that previously would have thought would be in the far fringes of politics have now moved more into the mainstream. And I don't think we can discount that too easily. Something else Hofstadter talked about was he said, well, now in the 1950s, we have, quote, mass media, which allows for these kind of conspiratorial ideas or tropes to be much more vivid and widely known. Well, if you compare the mass media today to Hofstadter's time, Hofstadter's mass media was small beer. We've got this completely different information environment where we have essentially instantaneous distribution of misinformation and disinformation. And, people used to joke about it and say, oh, well, isn't it weird that a lot of the president's tweets sound like your, crazy uncle on Facebook? And we have a tendency to laugh this off and to, laugh it away and say, oh, well, it's not really serious. We don't have to worry about it. But, we do have to worry about it. And the people who were, fearing for their lives in the Capitol last week didn't think it was a joke when they heard people screaming about hanging the vice president, or they saw these people with QAnon merchandise on them. Maybe we could talk a bit more about QAnon and that whole kind of fringe in a bit, but I just wanted to build on what Kori was saying about President Biden and his priorities. I mean, it's an understatement to say that the events are overshadowing the inauguration. I mean, David, you're in DC, there are 25,000 troops there.
Right.
And we have to be open about the fact that they're there to prevent further terrorist violence by supporters of President Trump. And that's a bizarre thing to have to say, but it's real. Yeah. I think, as Kori was saying, President Biden's best bet is to govern like a grown-up, remind people what that's like. I think that's one of the most healing things he can do for the United States. I'm not sure how the whole kind of impeachment/trial thing will be juggled in political terms. Maybe Dana could speak a bit about that in some more detail. I have to say, it does stick in the craw somewhat to hear a lot of people in the past week talk about unity and reconciliation. I think, as many people said, how can you have unity without accountability? And I think that Biden's difficult act will be to walk the line between trying to unite the country, trying to open his arms as much as he can to all Americans who want to try and put some of the recent past behind them. But I don't think that extends to some kind of blanket amnesty to seditionists.
Thank you very much. Dana.
Thanks. Well, don't think I've heard anything from either of my co-panelists that I don't agree with heartily. I mean, on the question, if it devolves to me to, address the question about the impact of an impeachment trial, I think it's very hard to say. There was a hint in what Kori said, which I would, if this is what she was saying, I would definitely agree. I do think that the Republican senators could do the country, but also their party, and in some cases their own individual ambitions, a great service by voting to convict. I mean, I think it's kind of a get out of jail card if they would play it. I think odds are that that's not going to happen. And what is it? We need 17. You would need 17 Republican senators. There's also the fact that it is a dilemma. I don't think that the House had any choice but to impeach. Within days of when they were physically attacked. Having said that, the reporting and sort of the body language of President-elect Biden is that, this was not something he saw as exactly what he needed at this time. And there will be logistical and how shall I put it, bandwidth issues in trying to move quickly at the same time that the Senate is proceeding with an impeachment trial. I mean, I definitely agree. I certainly would not quarrel at all with the notion that I think both Ben and Kori expressed, that unity requires accountability. In practice, that is somewhat difficult. I mean, it's worth remembering that obviously the biggest crisis, the crisis that the president-elect faces is the COVID crisis. And when you have an issue that is going to inflame passions on both sides, if you have an impeachment that's going to inflame passions on both sides, in a sort of surreal situation, those are also different sides on public health. I mean, identity for a large, the identity of a large number of, Trump diehard supporters is bound up in not wearing masks. And, what Joe Biden really needs is to get, and what the country needs is to get these people to wear masks. So, sorry, that was a kind of cry of desperation more than a suggestion of the way forward, but it's clearly what the Biden administration is going to have to navigate in the first instance.
David, can I add one quick thing to Dr. Allin's points?
Of course.
Because I think leadership really matters. Yeah. And using the tools of government, I actually think is really going to change the mood. When you have the FBI assertively investigating these mob scenes rather than being discouraged by the president and in some cases the attorney general from doing so. When you install an attorney general that's going to make an end to voter suppression a priority, that's going to change. When you have one of the president's first executive orders being the requirement that federal officials and Americans on federal property have to wear masks, that will change when you begin to police those things. And it will change when you see leaders wearing masks routinely. It probably won't affect the 30%, but it will have a big effect on what in terrorism studies we call the reconcilables.
Right. Thank you very much. Let me turn to America's place in the world. And will these events, or do these events really influence America's place in the world? There's been a bit of a debate between the view that this is a blip and the view that it's more than this, that these events will make it harder for America to exert influence in the rest of the world. Dana, as the long-standing Yank in London, what are your views on this?
Well, I don't think that, I don't think it's going to be seen as a blip. I mean, I'm obviously thinking in the first instance about American allies. They were obviously horrified by what they saw last week. From pronouncements in Beijing and Moscow suggested that the governments in those countries were rather amused and, dare I say, even delighted. I mean, it's always a big subject, and as Kori was saying, performance can make a big difference, and a strong performance by the new administration, I think, will make a big difference in the way America is seen after these events. I mean, I remember, one thing that puts paid or kind of refutes the notion that there is a widespread visceral anti-Americanism among allies like the French or even the Germans is just to see, I mean, I recall how delighted they were and how excited they were by the inauguration of Barack Obama. And, I think that if you look at for example, Emmanuel Macron's speech last week, or remarks last week after the events at the Capitol, you could see this was a genuinely heartfelt view of reference to what America is at its best rather than what we had just been seeing. I guess the other thing I would add is that there is probably a kind of widespread and I think overly simplistic and mechanistic kind of view of sort of internalizing theories of American decline. And, I actually, I mean, I think the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, and I'm not sure everyone here will agree with me, is going to be very attentive to the limits on American power and the dangers of trying to do too much and show up those limits. But I think mechanistic ideas of the rise and fall of nations are not always exactly what's going on. I think America, if it can, to take Kori's possibly more optimistic nuance about the resources of American democracy and American society, if the administration can summon those, I think sort of, cliches about the end of the American era might seem a little bit premature. But I don't, so I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth. I certainly don't think what we are seeing in the United States is trivial or meaningless. We have a lot of problems, and it's going to affect our ability it's going to affect our ability to lead, and the way the way the Biden administration should seek to lead.
Ben, looking at the transatlantic relationship, will these events give greater oxygen to the more autonomy focused side of the European discussion about transatlantic relations or not? What's your sense here?
I mean, like Dana, I think there's this interesting tension in that traditionally we would say, oh, well, the Europeans sneer at the Americans with their stupid idea of exceptionalism. But at the same time, there's this, overt horror at what happened and this desecration, and I use that word kind of carefully, of the Capitol and what it represents. And this knowledge that there is something about the United States that is somewhat exceptional and that people rather like having around. On the issue of strategic autonomy, yes, I imagine it will fuel certain people's arguments that this shows that Europe needs to be able to look after itself. There's been some recent polling of European peoples, and a majority of them believe that China will be more powerful than the US within a decade, and they want their country to stay neutral in any US-China conflict. I suppose the follow-up question to that is, well, what are they going to do about it? I mean, I think our institute has done quite a lot of work about how much money would be required to have kind of meaningful, strategic autonomy in military terms, and I don't see a lot of that money being coughed up, especially given that we're all now, massively indebted thanks to the COVID calamity. I would say that 1 in 3 Europeans, including more than half of Germans, think that after Trump, the US is not to be trusted. They think, in 4 years' time, we could have another Trumpist president, if not Trump himself. And what was really startling to me when I looked at this data was that the 2 countries with the warmest view of the US and its political system and how well it was doing are Poland and Hungary, which, as you know, are kind of somewhat more on the authoritarian end of the scale. And I frankly found that very dismaying.
Kori, what about US-China?
So as Dana mentioned, the Chinese are enjoying this moment and driving the point home that this kind of chaos, this kind of upheaval is the natural part of the American system. And don't you want the reliability of Communist Party control instead of this? And it will get some traction, there's no doubt, because watching the chaotic mess that is the United States, it was for me incredibly poignant to hear President Macron, to hear the government of Australia, to hear America's closest friends sad at what was happening. That China and Russia believe it will serve a political purpose for them. They're certainly right in the near term, but the flip side of the coin is also true, which is that the American military wasn't part of defending President Trump's claims. American police weren't part of defending President Trump's claims, that these people are going to get their day in court. And the process by which we are going to hold people accountable is something that many Chinese may wish they could have in their own society, right? And so I'm not sure it plays as cleanly as the Chinese government would hope it plays, because again, this isn't, while the insurrection at the Capitol and the challenges President Trump has posed for democracy in America are quite severe, I also think the lesson is that the constraints of democracy have held. And it shows how much institutionalized limits on power really matter when there are threats to freedom. So I'm not sure it plays out just as advantageously for the Chinese. The other thing is that, to Dana's point about the decline of America being premature, I've always loved Walter Russell Mead's reflection that Britain and the United States have been declining since their inception, and yet somehow they still manage to persevere and succeed, because democratic governance gives you the ability to solve problems, to find a new basis for public consensus, for using tools of power in a way that solve people's problems and thereby change the political calculus of the country. If you just look at the way the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States have traded policy preferences over the last 100 years, it's because they are always turning keys in the lock, trying to build a national political majority. And that's what democratic governance gives you, the ability to fix your problems and find new saddle points, to use Tom Schelling's term, for agreement.
Great comments. So it's now time to open up to the floor. We have a few questions that have been written down already. If others would like to raise their hands, they can go into the participant list and raise your hand and I will call on you. But let me start with Fabio Bassagni. Can we get Fabio's microphone turned on?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Sorry for my probably too much of an Italian view, but the 6th of January looked to many of us like a barbecue gone wrong. And the impression here in Europe is that the FBI and the security forces knew about it all along, but let it happen in order to get rid of Trump once and for all, showing the craziness of the implication of what he has been doing. So I think maybe it's too Machiavellian and too cynical, but the thought is irresistible.
Thank you, Fabio. I'm going to take a handful of questions now, and then we'll have a round with our panel to respond. Nicholas McLean.
I wondered how we can see the return of reason in American politics, particularly for the 30%. What can be done to de-indoctrinate the 30% about the big lie? And in terms of the wearing of masks, is there any evidence that diehards who don't wear them are dying harder and more often?
Great question, Nicholas. Good point. Douglas Agnew.
Yes, good day. We understand that Mr. Biden appreciates the United States has to rebuild alliances, but how specifically is he going to do that? I'm thinking in terms of, I live here in the UK, and there's a lot of discontent given his lukewarm attitude towards a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, which is probably next to COVID, the most important issue here. And I've read in the papers that in the very near future, possibly tomorrow, he's going to withdraw the permits enabling the construction of the American leg of the Keystone XL pipeline, something on which the Canadian industry and government has spent billions of dollars after President Trump signed the permits into force. So how is he going to rebuild alliances with countries he's alienating?
Very good questions. Let me turn to our panel. Dana, would you like to go first on these?
Let me take the last one first. I mean, I guess it's the Keystone question. I wouldn't answer directly, except to say that it does show. I think there are going to be a lot of issues where partners of the United States are going to have whiplash, or do have whiplash, if we keep going back and forth between sort of radically different views of American interests and American purposes. A more salient example for me is the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. But on the trade agreement, I guess I kind of take issue with the premise of the question that this is really the most important thing that the most important issue for Britain. I mean, a trade agreement with the United States is going to be hard to negotiate because there are all sorts of neuralgic issues tied up with it. But mainly, it's going to be a minuscule compensation for the economic issues associated with Brexit. Now, of course, those economic issues are overwhelmed by the economic issues associated with COVID, so we won't really be paying that much attention to them for a while. But yeah, it is true that the Biden team includes people who were very skeptical about the benefits of Brexit, are deeply attached to the Good Friday Agreement and America's role in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement. So there was a little bit of built-in tension with the Johnson government, but I wouldn't necessarily exaggerate that. On the first question, yeah, I think that's a little bit too clever a conspiracy to imagine, but it does raise, another way of raising this question is how could this happen? And I certainly agree with Kori that it wasn't a question of collusion, but somehow I think, the American system was not really prepared to deal with a security threat created by the president. That's just a difficult thing to be on top of. Something else that many people observed was the different treatment of a almost exclusively white mob compared to what would have happened if this mob had been black. And I think that that does raise serious issues about American justice and American equity. Sorry, I went on too long.
Okay. Kori.
So I think that last point Dana made is a really important one. If those people had been visibly Arabic or Black, police would have treated them very differently. And that's, I think, we have a lot of reckoning to do there about policing standards. But I want to push back on Fabio's question because it doesn't make any sense to me why, if the FBI had the ability to remove President Trump, why they would wait until 2 weeks before his term expired to do that. I think that dramatically overstates the spread of the FBI's abilities. And President Trump, with impunity, fired 2 directors of the FBI? And so I think the balance of power lies squarely with the chief executive, not with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The other thing is, please, my friends, remember that the United States the American government is a government built by people who distrust the effective use of power. So the Capitol Police not talking to the DC police, the Pentagon offering National Guard support and having it turned down by the mayor of DC, only to have her insist on having it immediately when the crisis gets out of hand. Please remember that the distribution of power in different localities in the United States is a feature of our system. And that would have made it very difficult to be able to have responded in an efficient, especially coercive way in the United States. I want to take a whack at the second question too, which is, which to me, I think it really matters that we are in the middle of a fast rushing river of transformation of communications. The IT revolution, as Ben said, the ability to immediately send false information out with no mediation by editors or publishers to millions of people. And the fact that correcting misinformation, the scholars of this show us, actually reinforces the original lie in people's minds. We're still figuring out how to deal with this age of media, but I don't think we should lack confidence that we will figure it out. Just as we did with radio, when it became a major means of political mobilization under Father Coughlin in the 1930s, just as we did with television. I think you're likely to see, well, we have seen the social media companies late in the game, it is true, but begin to at least strike poses of social conscience about the political damage that their toys have created. I think you're going to see a lot of regulation. You've already got an oversight board to try and create rules about who you deplatform and under what circumstances. So we are going to get there to a place where you tame the Wild West of social media, but we're just not there yet.
Ed.
Thanks, David. Going through the questions briefly, to Fabio's point, yeah, I mean, I agree with my colleagues. I think this was more a case of complacency than conspiracy. Nicholas McLean's great question about how do we de-indoctrinate the 30%? I don't know. I'm not actually that optimistic about that. I'm struggling to think of a kind of pleasant analogy or example when that's happened and that's worked, other than after enormous total military defeat, when an ideology is essentially not considered acceptable anymore, say in Germany or wherever it would be. And we can see, I mean, you know, we can see if we stay in the United States, a lot of the people in the assault last week were waving Confederate flags. You know, we can see that was 160 years ago, and that ideology hasn't quite been stamped out yet, more's the pity. So I'm afraid I don't have a happy answer for that question. On the Biden-UK trade agreement, yeah, I mean, as Dana said, you know, if we're lucky and there's a trade deal, the benefit it will do to British GDP is totally insignificant compared to the self-inflicted blow of leaving the European Union. One thing is that the kind of Pelosi veto that was threatened about if there was any kind of, you know, interference with the Good Friday Agreement from imposing a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland will hopefully not come up, because the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has helpfully kind of imposed a customs border within the United Kingdom, which is kind of I don't know if a historical precedent for that either. So I don't think that will be such an issue, but I'm not sure there's a huge clamoring of people. I mean, I'm looking in London now at the window. I can't see any mobs here saying we definitely want to import some lower standard food from the United States as quickly as possible.
I object to that description of food from the United States.
Okay, sorry, I withdraw my comments.
Although you did live in Boston, so maybe your experience.
Having fewer food standards or farm or things like that, it's not something I think most people are clamoring for. And also, speaking of Boston, there is a kind of parochialism amongst a lot of British people when they think of the United States and think, oh, the special relationship and these people owe us, you know, some kind of special deal. Well, as others have pointed out, you know, President Biden talks about himself as an Irishman. And, you know, I challenge anyone to go to South Boston on St. Patrick's Day and talk about the special relationship loudly. I would advise.
Good point. So we've got 5 more minutes. I've got 4 quick questions. 2 are from friends of mine. I would only ask that you lead them, that you do quick questions or comments, and then we'll go for 1 minute each for our panelists. Let me call on Fleur de Villiers, please.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. I noticed that Dana referred to the only approval ratings that Trump enjoyed in Europe were from Poland and Hungary. Poland and Hungary are 2 examples of the sort of resurgent populism, which, as somebody who was born before the Second World War, I believe poses the greatest threat, and it shows just how fragile, really fragile, democracy is. I have been appalled by polls in the UK recently, which show that over 50% of young people don't believe in democracy. And therefore, I think one has to be, there's still a tendency to regard Trump and what he did as an aberration. I devoutly hope that it is, but one of the mistakes that was made was by treating him, giving him during his presidency, because of the office he held, a certain degree of tolerance, which reminded me of the way in which the Weimar Republic responded to Hitler, and the way in which Mussolini and Hitler came to power on the back of huge tsunamis of populism. I admire Kori's optimistic view, but unless one can effectively defang Trump, because populism needs and requires a leader, and one has to do it in whatever way one can, it's going to be extremely difficult for the democracy as we understand it and as we always respected in the United States, where the institutions held during Watergate. I just think one can't be too sanguine about the future, either in the United States or in fact in Europe.
Thank you, Fleur. Bruno Hesch. Can we get Bruno on?
Are you listening to me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. So I was wondering about your views in terms of the future of the Republican Party. So do you think we will have a Trumpian Republican Party with Trump or without Trump? And what are the implications of that for relations with allies, namely with European allies and also with multilateral institutions like the European Union and NATO? Thank you.
Thank you. Philip Nelson. Philip, can we get him on?
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, thank you. I think I had a question about the 30%, but I think that's been dealt with. My question is, what about business?
Yeah, good question. So what's the business? What are the business supporters of Trump going to do? That's a very good question. Adrian Cowderoy for the final question. Adrian? Okay. There he is. Okay, Adrian.
Sorry, wrong button. The discussion has been made on mistakes made by President Trump and the Republicans. Is there a risk that extreme elements of the Democrats will push Republicans to continue that extremism, perhaps in new forms?
It's a really interesting question. Let me ask each of our speakers for 1 minute of final comments that address some of the concerns that were just raised. And let me begin with Ben, go to Dana, and conclude with Kori.
Thanks, David. Yeah, just building on Fleur's points, when I mentioned about Poland and Hungary, about these being the more authoritarian states in Europe, yeah, it's very alarming. And, as Fleur points out, there's this horrible, what we've witnessed is this horrible kind of impulse of a sizable minority of the population in many, many countries to submit to a leader. Whatever we tell ourselves about our history of political pluralism and kind of mature political culture, and even after the Capitol assault, 42% of Republican voters say they would like Trump to be the nominee in 2024, and another 6% want his son to be the nominee. So that's almost 50% of Republican voters. Now that may well change in the next few years, and I hope that it will, and I hope that there'll be some people who bring out more positive trends in the Republican Party in the intervening period. But I don't think we can dismiss that. And I don't think, as Fleur said, that we can dismiss what people say. We need to take what people say very seriously because it has very real world consequences. Talking about extremism on both sides, I think there is something we need to think about there. And I think there is a worrying tendency on both sides of the political spectrum. I'm not doing a kind of vulgar equivalence here. I'm not saying that people to the extreme of the Democratic Party are the same as, you know, the mob murdering people in the Capitol. I just want to be very clear about that. But I think we do have to be careful to remember that, you know, paranoid worldviews are not exclusive to one particular branch of the political spectrum or any one country, and that they can be a risk, let me put it, in many different places.
Thank you very much, Ben. Dana.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief. I mean, Fleur, it's very good to hear from you, and your, you know, sort of cri de coeur, I think, is something one has to take very seriously. You know, this has been the big issue of our last 4 years or our last 5 years. Is this an aberration or is this the new normal? And I don't have a totally reassuring answer to this, except to point out that, you know, as I think Kori mentioned, Donald Trump never had majority support among the public. He was not decisively, he was not overwhelmingly repudiated at the polls, but he was repudiated by a majority of Americans. Now, that would be my optimistic case. And you know, I think we have a new administration facing huge challenges. I think it's probably up to them. Another, you know, on a note of encouragement, and I hope this doesn't sound too partisan, but you had on the same day as the insurrection confirmation that the state of Georgia elected its first Jewish and its first Black senator in history, and in both cases, obviously gave the Democrats thin control of the Senate. But you know, at the end of the day, as you know, if you want to talk about the continuities of the dark part of the soul, it's true that insurrectionists in the Capitol were carrying the Confederate flag. So I wanted to end on an optimistic note, but I guess I ended there.
Kori, you get the last word.
Couple of quick points. First, I think that there were a lot of business people who said, but judges, but tax cuts, but rolling back the administrative and regulatory state. And the insurrection has driven up the price of those businesses' support to President Trump, to anybody in his family, and to the Republicans who egged it on, right? That you see Josh Hawley can't get a hotel contract to hold a fundraiser because Senator Hawley had egged the insurrection on. Those gleeful jihadists at the Lincoln Project are going to continue to force every single business to be on the record about what they think about this and who they're giving money to. And that's how civil society keeps government honest in the United States. The Fleur de Villiers' point, I agree with that we can't be complacent, and there were too many people who said, but the guardrails will hold, or the adults in the room will deal with this. The institutions of American democracy have held, but just barely. And as Fleur knows, the reason I left a job I love as the Deputy Director General of the IISS was to be more personally involved in trying to prevent the president's re-election. So I agree and endorse her view.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists, to our attendees. I thought this was a great discussion, and I think we raise some very difficult questions, most particularly just how can you get a more fact-based dialogue occurring among a broader spectrum of the electorate, and that the 30% number, which I think is about the right number, that's still an extraordinarily big number, and it's one that unless it diminishes, will have negative consequences for American democracy going forward, in my view. With that, let me thank everyone. Very, very great having you all here, and call an end to our discussion this morning. Thank you all very, very much. Bye-bye now.